Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the top 5 budget decks in Disney Lorcana. My name is Spessy. I'm making all sorts of Lorcana content, so make sure you're subscribed for more. In the next few days, there's going to be another budget video where I'm going to look at the top meta decks, but show you budget versions of them. This video is a little bit different. There are a couple decks in here which I think are very competitive, but we're mainly aiming at super budget friendly and fun decks to play, which can also still be pretty powerful. I wanted every ink color to be represented, and I was aiming for each deck to be $50 or less. There are a couple decks in here which are slightly over that, but there's good reason for that. The first deck we're looking at is the only Sapphire deck, and Sapphire, interestingly, is the deck I struggled with most. I think the reason for that is because while Sapphire has a lot of cheap cards in it, cards like Mickey Mouse are ramping you up, where you're playing Mickey Mouse on turn 3 to gain more ink in the future turns. But then once you're at 7 ink and things like that, you want to be playing expensive cards. Cards like Hades, for example, in Sapphire, who is about $13 to $14 a piece. So what I wanted to do with this version then is ramp into some cheaper cards. And the card I wanted to build around in particular was Tamatoa and Grand Pabby. Now, this is a deck I'm going to be playing quite a lot more of in the next couple days, and I'm going to be trying to optimize it. So there will be a separate video on the most refined version of this deck coming out on my YouTube channel. So make sure you look out for that. Grand Pabby is a really interesting card because whenever you remove 1 or more damage from one of your characters, you gain 2 lore. It's a very cheap card, but potentially very powerful. And when you combine it with Amber, there's quite a lot of interesting synergies. For example, we've got this Rapunzel card, which when you remove 1 or more damage from one of your characters, you draw a card. So she gives us a nice draw engine. And you've also got this new Pluto Determined Defender, which at the start of your turn removes up to 3 damage from this character. And what I find really interesting about pairing Amber with Sapphire now is this new Pluto Friendly Pooch card. If we play Pluto on turn 1, we exert it on turn 2, we're able to play Mickey Mouse or Winnie the Pooh on turn number 2. Now, with this Winnie the Pooh card, you do need to be careful because we don't have an abundance of card draw in this one necessarily, and you're putting cards from your hand into your inkwell. It says you may put a card from your hand into your inkwell. So Winnie the Pooh is going to be a great way of getting rid of uninkables from your hand. This deck has 20, which is a lot, but Winnie the Pooh is able to actually put uninkable cards from your hand into your inkwell, which is quite a nice option to have. But again, what you do need to be careful of is if your Winnie the Pooh is staying on the board for 3 or 4 turns, you probably want to stop putting cards from your hand into your inkwell, because otherwise you're going to run out of cards. What this deck also has, which is a really nice tool that the Sapphire ink color has, is the Popsicle package. Popsicle is a very cheap card. When you combine it with Flaversham, you get lots of card draw. Nick Wilde also usually gets cut from the top meta decks, but for this budget-friendly deck is a really nice option, being able to put more Popsicles back on the board. And also Tamatoa just gives us a nice, powerful top end. This deck has a bunch of items, including Lantern, which is another ramp tool, Popsicles as well. There are also the cards Dingle Hopper and Gumbo Pot, which are 1 and 2 cost cards, which can do some more healing, which could work really well with the Grand Pabby, so they're worth looking at. We also have Jasmine in this one, who's not fantastic, but she has some nice Grand Pabby synergy. Again, this is a deck I'm looking to refine over the next day or 2. It's the worst deck of the bunch, but absolutely a interesting budget version of playing Sapphire. Now, the next deck is a classic budget deck, and it is a evasive deck. This one coming in at $33, but there's definitely ways you could make this more expensive if you wish to do so. The key card really in this one, and this is what you're going to find in a lot of these budget decks, are these 1 cost cards which are questing for 2. Aggro seems to be the best way to go for budget players, and this Cursed Merfolk is quite expensive at the moment at $2.25, but I would honestly expect the price of this card to rise over the next few days. But if you've got a aggressive opener like Cursed Merfolk, you can play this on turn 1, quest with it, and then you could perhaps play LeFou on turn 2 to ready Cursed Merfolk and try and get more questing from her or it. We've also got the new Simba Scrappy Cub card, which can quest for 3. We have the Flynn Rider on turn 2, which can quest for 2 and has the same ability as Cursed Merfolk. Ursula Deceiver is also a really good tool for aggro decks because you're able to discard your opponent's Grab Your Swords, which is a really threatening card at removing our board. Then when we get to turn 3 is when we can start playing our evasive threats. Minnie Mouse in particular is the best evasive card in the game, questing for 2. We've also got Tinkerbell and Pongo, which are very similar cards coming in on turn 4, which are very hard for our opponents to deal with. I've then built the deck in a way where we have lots of top end with cards like Kuzco, Ray, Stitch, Goofy. All 3 of these are evasive. Kuzco also has some really interesting synergy with Shield of Virtue. Shield of Virtue is a item card which you can spend 3 ink, which is a lot, to ready a character. And what you can do, you can quest with your Kuzco, ready your Kuzco, and because of its ward ability, your opponent isn't going to be able to remove your Kuzco unless they have like double Grab Your Swords, for example. So that's a really interesting bit of synergy. Also, I put 1 copy of Mother Knows Best in here. You might want to include a couple more. And I also did want to include Milo Thatch as a bit of a budget shout-out option. Milo Thatch only going for $4.50 right now and probably going to continue to fall a little bit because no meta decks are playing him. But he is a very powerful card potentially, and if you have the 1-cost Milo Thatch, you're able to shift this guy on. There's also, of course, Morph in the Emerald faction, which is a 2-cost card. We're going to be looking at that in another deck. And Milo Thatch can also shift onto that, so I wanted to give that a mention. Kick Cloud Kicker, also a really nice card in these aggro decks because you're bouncing back one of your opponent's cards into their hand, disrupting their game plan. It's really good in the current meta. And this overall, I think, looks like a pretty powerful deck on a huge budget of only $33. And of course, if you get rid of the Milo, that becomes even more cheap. All right, in at number 3, we have Hyper Aggro, and look at that, we're at $58, so we're slightly over the mark on this one. We're also at a lot of uninkables on 20, but this deck is one of my favorites of all time. I actually played a deck like this in an online tournament recently. This deck really struggles against Steel, but has really good matchups elsewhere. It did get a few new tools in set 2. In particular, it got the new Simba Scrappy Cub and Chernobog's Followers. Now, what this deck is looking to do is it's looking to cap out at 4 ink. You never want to go beyond 4 ink in your inkwell in this deck, and this deck has 0, that's right, 0 card draw outside of the new Chernobog's Followers cards. So this deck is super aggressive. You want to play the Maleficent ideally on turn 1, then on turn 2 you're either looking to bounce it back with Madam Mim or perhaps use LeFou to ready it, and then you can get more questing power with Maleficent. And there's also a really cool loop with this deck where you play your Arthur down. When you quest with Arthur, he is then going to gain you 2 lore, 3 lore total, but gaining you 2 lore if you bounce a card back to your hand. So what you can do is you can bounce back LeFou and then replay LeFou the same turn to ready Arthur, and suddenly your deck becomes incredibly difficult to deal with. Now this deck also using the Minnie Mouse, also using Pongo, we have Merlin's Goat as well, and we have 4 copies of Fan the Flames and 4 copies of Bosses on a Roll, as well as 4 copies of Sorcerer's Spellbook. These 12 cards are the most flexible slots. A lot of you are going to be really surprised at playing 4 copies of Sorcerer's Spellbook, but what this deck is really looking to do is it's just looking to get really close to 20 lore as quickly as possible, and then just get across the line with cards like Merlin's Goat, which guarantees you lore, Bosses on a Roll, and Sorcerer's Spellbook, which guarantee you lore. And Fan the Flames is another really interesting option for your Arthur, for example. You ready your Arthur, and you just keep questing, and you become really, really difficult to deal with. A deck like this is particularly strong when going first, and is going to struggle a little bit more when going second. But it's one of my favorite decks from set 2, and I still think it's a very, very powerful and underrated deck. I think this deck actually has the potential to win tournaments, as long as you don't queue into Steel, and you go first a lot of the time. You can beat Steel with this deck, but if you're going second and you play against Steel, it's going to be such a tricky time. And that's probably why we don't see a hyper aggro deck like this performing well in tournaments, because the top players want a little bit more agency over the deck, where they don't just want to lose if they queue a bad matchup. Whereas this deck kind of does that, but it is an absolute menace to deal with so many of the other decks in the meta. I think this one is really, really strong, and absolutely a deck which could win a tournament if you get lucky enough in your matchups. Okay, up next, and again, we're at $58, but I wanted to include the Arthurs. The Arthurs the most expensive card, the Maleficents as well. What you're going to see often is these one-cost aggressive questers being quite expensive as well. But a really, really fun deck. Also, the Madam Mim Fox, pretty expensive card, but this Madam Mim Fox is good in so many decks. I think it's a worthy investment. A lot of the expensive cards here are pretty good in a bunch of different decks. Okay, up next is one I'm really excited for, and we're at $51 in this one, so ever so slightly over the mark. We're at 16 uninkables here, so that's around the kind of standard mark. This hyper aggro deck being on at 20 is certainly over the average, but I personally am a believer of playing a lot of uninkables. Now, this deck is a deck which was very popular in the first week meta of Disney Lorcana Into The Inklands, except we've cut the most expensive card, which is the Ursula Legendary card. And I have to say that card, a little bit overrated in this deck anyway. This is a serious meta contender in general, just this combo of Emerald and Amethyst. And really the reason that this is going to be a great budget option is because, again, the Madam Mim Fox, the Madam Mim Snake, the friends on the other side, the Merlin Rabbit, the Merlin Goat. These cards are very, very cheap and just so good in so many different decks. So if you're just looking to build one deck, this would probably be the one I would suggest, because the Madam Mim Snakes, the Madam Mim and Merlin package is just so good in a variety of decks. Similarly, you can see we've got these Cursed Merfolk and Maleficents, kind of a common theme for these budget decks, that you do want these slightly more expensive cards in the deck. That's really where the price of this one is going up. But once you have these cards, they can be slotted into so many other decks. And what this deck is looking to do is looking to win pretty quickly. You want to be playing an aggressive card on turn 1 and then probably Madam Mimming it back into your hand on turn 2. But perhaps you also just play your Flynn Rider on turn 2 for some more aggressive questing. Then on turn 3, you're looking at your rush cards like Madam Mim and Rafiki to deal some damage to your opponent's cards, or some card draw options like Maleficent. Cloud Kicker also in this one to gain a bunch of tempo, bouncing back a card like Ursula into your opponent's hand. We've got the Goats and the Rabbits on turn 4, as well as Tinkerbell, this evasive card we've seen in other decks. Mad Hatter in this one, and also quite excitingly, a card I think a lot of people are underestimating in the current meta is Robin Hood Daydreamer, a new set 3 card, which, because this deck has an abundance of card draw with cards like Maleficent, Rabbit, and Frenzy on the other side, it is possible to get to 6 ink, and Robin Hood Daydreamer questing for 4 is definitely not a card that you should underestimate. Questing for 4 is pretty obscene. Now, if you also wanted to make this a little bit more expensive, instead of the Mad Hatter, you could look at playing Kuzco, for example, or you could also look at playing Genie on the Job, which is a 6-cost uninkable card. A couple copies of Genie on the Job instead of Mad Hatter, for example, would make this deck even more powerful, but slightly more expensive and higher on the uninkable count. I think this is a really, really strong deck. I would not be surprised at all if the Ursula actually ends up, the very expensive Ursula actually just gets cut from this list, because there's lots of answers to Ursula in the current meta. Cards like Cloud Kicker, cards like the 2-cost Pinocchio in Amethyst, which is a 1/1 card, not the same Pinocchio as this, it's a different Pinocchio that's also a 1/1, and it, when played, it is exerting a card, and lots of players are teching that card in to exert your Ursula, Deceiver of All, which is a very expensive card, and then she's removed quite easily by cards like Madam Mim. So this deck looks really powerful. I think it's a great option. I think this deck could absolutely win some local tournaments and is a really good way to go. Now, the top deck is the most expensive of the bunch. However, I have my reasons. This one's coming in at $67. However, okay, the reason this is my top deck, and this is a Pride Lands deck, I actually have a full video because there's a slightly different version of this, which is an $86 version. So this is the slightly cheaper version. But the reason for this is pretty much all of the price in this deck is on one card, which is Rockstar Stitch. Rockstar Stitch is currently at $7. Probably going to go up. I'm going to warn you. I think this card's going to go up in price. And the reason I wanted to make this the top deck is because if you just invest into Rockstar Stitch, you can build so many interesting competitive decks with this card and very little else. And this deck is an example of that. What this deck is looking to do, it's looking to play on turn 1 Simba Future King, who has the Prince tag. On turn 2, we play this Pride Lands card, which while a Prince or King character is here, you pay 1 ink less for all your characters. So Simba on turn 1, Pride Lands on turn 2. On turn 3, we can spend 2 ink to move Simba Future King, Into the Pride Lands, and then all of our characters cost 1 less, which means all of our 1-cost characters cost 0. So we can play our Stitch New Dog for free. Then on turn 4, we can shift in our Rockstar Stitch, and then all of our 1-cost cards suddenly cost 0. So we can just slam all these 1-cost cards and fill the board in a ridiculous manner. If you want to see my video on that, it's here. You can check that one out. And then you're looking at playing Bare Necessities in particular, most likely singing it with a card like Cinderella, who's also a little bit more pricey. You don't have to play this card, but she is worth it, and she's also good in other meta decks, in other Amber Steel decks in particular, which is quite nice. You sing Bare Necessities, which is going to be able to discard your opponent's Grab Your Sword, and therefore that's giving you a lot of coverage against Steel. Be Our Guest is in here to just increase your consistency of finding Rockstar Stitch. This deck is really looking to just find Rockstar Stitch, and if you find Rockstar Stitch, you're in a pretty good spot. If you don't find Rockstar Stitch, the deck is going to fall on its head. But I wanted to highlight this deck because there's so many interesting and competitive Rockstar Stitch decks that you can play, and in fact I am going to be making a top 5 Rockstar Stitch decks, probably a Rockstar Stitch deck for every ink combination, so look out for that as well. So those are my top 5 budget decks. Again, more budget friendly decks to come soon, in particular some more Rockstar Stitch decks, in particular those top meta decks, but swapping out those really expensive cards like Robin Hood and Beast, for example. If you did enjoy this budget deck video, let me know if you want to see 5 more budget decks as well. I am definitely keen to experiment more with budget-friendly content. I'm quite new to the Disney Lorcana content, and I'm still trying to work out exactly what my audience is looking for. So do let me know if there's any other budget decks you're particularly interested in and would like me to cover in another video. If you watched this far, thank you so much. Make sure you subscribe for more stuff. I've also got a Patreon down below if you're interested in getting some Disney Lorcana coaching or some specific decks that are personalized for you, where you give me a deck request of some cards you want to build around, and I just build you that deck. So check out the Patreon. Make sure you subscribe. Thanks so much. It's been a blast, and see you on the next one. Bye now.